Today, we will be speaking about global distribution of income and its political meaning. Now, before I start, and here is a little bit of structure of the talk that you can, of course, read, I would like to make some definitions. People often don't like definitions, but I think in this case, we really have to be quite clear about what we're talking. When we say global distribution of income, we mean distribution of income between all citizens of the world. As you will see in a minute, I will talk about history, but that means also that if we were to look at global income distribution today, which we will do as well, we would actually look at the distribution of income among 7.4, 7.5 billion people. Now, obviously, we don't have the data for more than 7 billion people, but what we do have, we have household surveys which are representative for the countries, and we practically have household surveys that cover about 95% of the world. They cover also about 95% of the GDP of the world. So essentially, we are actually pretty good currently in estimating the overall distribution of income in the world. I have also to say that when we do define income, we define income in what is called international dollars. That means that these are dollars whose purchasing power in principle is the same in all the countries. Now, to explain a little bit what it is essentially you take a currency of a given country. Let's suppose you go to India and you take Indian rupees. Now, we know that Indian rupees, if you were just to do a conversion from the market exchange rate, will buy more food in India than they would buy in the US because simply the food is more expensive here. Or compare, like, for example, India to countries where the food is very expensive, like Norway or Iceland. So we have to adjust for that. And it's not only food, it's housing, it's clothing, many other things. So in order to adjust, we actually have a very large project, which is called International Comparison Project, that does price comparisons across the world. So we use the data from that project to re-express the rupees or the domestic currencies in terms of its actual purchasing power. So that particular unit is called the international dollar. So everything that I'll show you will be really calculated in international dollars, meaning that the questions like, do we really account for the fact that in Asia, for example, prices are lower than the US? The answer to that question is yes, and that will be throughout the presentation. So let me then start with the structure of the talk, and we'll see how far we get. We might not cover all of it, but we might cover like maybe 2/3. First of all, I think there are two things to realize that when we talk about global distribution of income, currently, we are talking about a very special period that we live through, which is that capitalism is the only mode of production, the only way that production is organized in different countries of the world, including in China. The second thing is that we are witnessing a period of the reemergence of Asia, which means that actually it is bringing the distribution of economic activity within this grand continent of Eurasia to the way that it looked around 1500. Now, why it is important to emphasize is because the period between the Industrial Revolution and the end of the 20th century might have been an anomaly in the global distribution simply because Asia was much poorer than Western Europe and North America. But that was not the case, let's suppose in 1500, where obviously America was quite underdeveloped and the level of income in most European countries was the same as in China. So we now have the sort of equalization in the world of, if you want to call it, convergence of income, mostly driven by the rise of mean incomes in Asia. Finally, what I would, when I do the inequality decompositions, I think it's important to sort of emphasize that inequality decompositions are not an objective in themselves. In other words, you do inequality decomposition not only simply to show the percentage of inequality that it is due, for example, to inequality between countries' incomes versus inequality within countries. but to explain politically what it means. So these numbers should not be just simply seen as numbers. They should be seen as numbers that reflect the social reality which is behind them. And I think it's important to mention to students in general, because whenever we do a decomposition, we really look for a political or social meaning of that decomposition. If you take, for example, inequality in New York and decompose it by boroughs, the objective of that is to tease out inequality between the boroughs and within the boroughs. It's not simply just to show a given number. Then I would actually say something about the difference between the world of averages and the world of heterogeneity, because it is the latter, the world of heterogeneity, that we can actually much better appreciate when we have detailed data from household surveys and micro data from across the world. And then maybe we'll say something about the political or philosophical issues which are raised when we look at global and not only at national inequalities. Now, let me start with the long run. The long run basically means that we go to the first attempts to actually estimate global inequality, which are due to a paper by François Bourguignon and Christian Morisson, published in the early 2000s, and which looks at estimates of global inequality from 1820 onwards until 1990. So in other words, they cover about 170 years of global inequality. Now, the data are based on Madison's estimates of GDP per capita, which have existed for a while and are being refined all the time. And I've done in this graph, I've taken the numbers from Bourguignon and Morisson about the distribution within countries, and then applied the new numbers from Agnes Madison's project. But whether you apply the new numbers or the old numbers from Madison project, the basic storyline is the same. So what is the storyline? Is that the Industrial Revolution can be seen as some kind of a big bang in development of inequality. Before the Industrial Revolution, the differences between country incomes were relatively limited. And as you can see on the vertical axis, where you have a Gini index, the Gini of the world was then estimated at around 55. Now, 55 is a large number in terms of Gini, but it's a number that, for example, many Latin American countries have today. So it is a high level of inequality, but even countries today have such high level inequality. So the world, as you can see even from the graph, as you can see that actually the Gini index goes up, the world was unequal, but not as dramatically as unequal in 1820, where our numbers begin, as it was in 1920, 100 years later, when we look at the situation after the World War I and just prior to the Great Depression. So the question then becomes like, how do we explain that increase in inequality between 1820 and 1920? Well, we explain it relatively easily by the rise of the West, by the Industrial Revolution, which precipitated increasing income of people living in Northwestern Europe and North America, and later in Japan, and they became richer compared to people in Asia, especially people in China and India. So if you want to have like a, how should I say, very simplified view of what is happening to global inequality, I think it is important to focus on three parts of the world: the West, India, and China. And these are three parts of the world that determine more or less 50+% of what's happening with global inequality. So when one part of the three, which in this case is the West, becomes richer, and the two parts, India and China, either are stagnant or decline, then of course you have widening disparities and rising inequality. I will come in a moment to what happened to inequalities within nation states, because obviously they play a role. But within this grand view of things, the major engine of rising inequality was indeed the rising gap between mean incomes of the nations of the West versus Asia. Then you notice actually in the second part of the 20th century, we still have the rising inequality. And then finally, after World War II and the period of US dominance, that increase of inequality comes to a stop. As you can see here, the Gini coefficient is extremely high. It's between 70 and 75. So it has actually increased from 55 to almost 75. So a significant increase over 150 years. And then at the very end of this graph, after approximately 1990, and based on much more detailed data that actually now we have, and I'm quoting here the work that Christoph Lackner and myself did. So these data are obviously better than the data which existed in the past. We noticed a very significant decline now of global inequality. And that's linked with the rise of Asia. Now, I have to say that one thing which sometimes confuses people is the following. How can we at the same time speak of increasing national inequalities and declining global inequality? It is important to realize that these two things are not paradoxical developments. They can actually happen, and they actually do happening now at the same time. In other words, at that very end that you see where decline inequality is driven by the catch-up or by convergence of incomes in Asia compared to the incomes in the rich countries. And this particular crisis, for example, the most recent one with the COVID virus, is something that would further accelerate that convergence, because as of now, it seems that countries in Asia would be less affected in terms of their growth rates than the rich world. So this is the part of the global convergence that plays such a big role in global inequality. But at the same time, inequalities within each nation state can go up. And indeed, if you compare today inequality in the US with inequality 30 or 40 years ago, if you do the same thing for China or India or Russia, you would find the increase of inequality. So these within national inequalities play a sort of an offsetting role. Ideally, we would have global convergence and declining inequality within countries. That would then really push global inequality down for two reasons. There will be countries converging in their mean incomes, and within each individual country, rich and more people will become similar. But that's not what we observe today. We observe the first element, which is the convergence of mean incomes, but within each individual country, rich and poor people become more and more dissimilar. So these are really these two effects that work one against another, and overall they determine what happens to global inequality. So another way to show that is precisely to look at these two elements over time. So this is the first element, which is the between country inequality. Now I'm actually showing it in the terms of the tail coefficient rather than the Gini. The reason being that the tail is what is called exactly decomposable, which means that when I put together the between country component and within country component, they add up exactly to the total tail coefficient. So notice here how small is that between country component in 1820. This reflects what I was saying before, small differences in mean incomes between nations. In other words, for example, China in those days, as we will see that later, it was about only 1/2 of the income of Great Britain. But that gap between China and Great Britain after 100 years, so in 1920, actually increased to 10-1. That, of course, is why, this is exactly why the blue bar is going up. So the blue bar shows that gaps between the countries are getting larger and larger, that the divergence between mean country incomes, it becomes greater. You see already by 1950, that divergence in the tail numbers is 60, whereas in the beginning of our period in 1820, it was less than 10. It stays at that very high level all the way to the years 2000. And then, of course, you see, as what we have already seen with the Gini coefficient, we see the decline of the between country inequality, or we see the other way to express that is to say that we see convergence of incomes. Now, the second component, as you know, is the component of within inequality. Now, go back here also to 1820. What do you observe? You observe really very high share of within country inequalities in total inequality. And that continues again for 100 years, and it's actually the blue bar is, the red bar indeed is becoming bigger and bigger, is rising. So when we look at the 19th century, what can we say? We can say that that century is characterized by, first, rising divergence between countries and rising inequality within countries. In other words, both the blue bar and the red bar are becoming longer, and the two of them together push global inequality up. So this is the first period that actually where we witnessed the increasing between country inequality and increasing within country inequality. So we can call it the age of empires and class struggles. It is the age of empires because it coincided with essentially European ability to project power abroad and to conquer and to sort of colonize countries in Asia and Africa. And at the same time, it coincided with a period of class struggles within nation states as reflected in the rising within national inequality. So there we had really for more than 100 years, we had two components rising in unison, as it were. Rising differences between countries and rising class polarization or rising inequality within nation states. So both of them push global inequality up. That period, broadly speaking, comes to an end after World War II, where we actually have something that was to people, for example, who were born at that time and lived their early life in that time, seemed really like a structural feature of the world, which was the division of the world in the three worlds. The first world, which are the rich countries, the second world, which was countries that are less rich, but most of them were socialist countries, and the third world, which was composed of Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Now, as you see, that world was sort of almost a paradigmic a reflection of large differences between the countries. You see that actually the blue bar is very, very high throughout that whole period. But you also notice that the red bar shrinks. Now, the red bar shrinking reflects what we now call, the period of easing of social tensions and social divergence within many of the countries. As we know, for example, after World War I, especially after World War II, the welfare state was created in the West. Socialist regimes in Eastern Europe and China dramatically reduced inequality within those countries. And even the third world countries, some of them which went for import substitution policies, also reduced inequality within countries. So in the second period, which I called here, as you can see, the age of the three worlds and diminished class conflict, we have very high divergence in incomes between nation states, but that divergence does not increase. And we have shrinkage of differences within countries. And then we come to the last period, which is basically the period that we live now. And this is the age of convergence, mostly because of Asia. We don't have yet convergence of Africa, which is, of course, a topic I will return later, because convergence of Africa is absolutely crucial for us to continue having convergence of incomes in the world, or in other words, for us to continue having this blue line, a blue bar rather, shrinking. But for the present, it is actually sufficiently strong, the convergence in Asia, that shrinks the blue bar. On the other hand, if you very carefully look at that, you would notice some widening of the red bar, indicating the increased polarization of cleavages of incomes within countries. So this is something that I was talking about before, rising inequality, whether it be Russia or China or United States or the UK or practically 2/3 of the countries in the world. And as you can see, then we really can very easily divide the global history of the last 200 years into three periods that I've just defined and discussed. But you know, this is the objective of the studies in global inequality, not simply to line up the numbers, but to actually make us understand what are the forces, grand forces that actually drive these numbers. So the political meaning of this decomposition is something that I already talked about. So here is simply the summary in words, that in any decomposition, we should look at social and political meaning, not just look at the numbers. And then in a global sense, we have to ask the question, what is the principal cleavage? Is the principal cleavage between the countries or between individuals within a country? You know, the implications of that are very different. If the principal cleavage is between the countries, it has implication on two things which can be studied independently and were both important. One, if the cleavage is between the countries, that means that first, inequality of opportunities between individuals in the world is heavily determined by where you were born. So that's a very important component. In other words, it means that the main cleavage which determines your future income is not necessarily whether you were born to a poor or rich family within a country, but whether you were born in a rich or poor country. The second, of course, implication of such a big cleavage is that you naturally will have large migration flows. Because if the gaps of income between countries are very large, then a way to sort of reduce that, and of course, the incentive of people to reduce that is to migrate. Differently, if you had a world, and imagine a world like that, where the differences between the countries were very small. It's a little bit like the European Union, the original European Union of EU 15, where the gaps between mean income in Germany or Italy and France are very small. Then you really have the cleavage becoming a class cleavage. In other words, the essential issue is not whether you were born as such in France or Germany. The essential issue is whether you were born in a poor or rich family in those countries. So that these two cleavages have worked actually differently in the three periods. So the third period is the period that for which I don't have a name of an author. I should think of an author that best reflects that period. But that period is relatively recent, and it's different from the other two because it has now diminishing inequalities between countries and increasing cleavage within countries. In some sense, it is not a period very dissimilar from the 19th century, precisely because the differences within nation states now are becoming more important. But the difference between that period and the early 19th century is that we now have Asia converging and not actually Asia and Europe and North America diverging as it was in the past. So it is a different period than the one in the 19th century. In other words, you can actually say if the rising incomes in Asia, which are actually driving this reduction of global inequality, lead to the increasing inequalities in advanced countries and also in countries like China, but individuals also care more about their relative national positions, then, as you can read here, then a concern with rising national inequalities would significantly outweigh in terms of welfare or your own interest, the advantages of rising welfare from the higher global absolute income. So we really have to take, when we talk about global inequality, now into account also how these inequalities are reflected in our individual sort of views of the world or nation states, and how we would actually observe the same reality, but some of us would be much more concerned with rising inequalities nationally, and others would actually be much more concerned with declining inequalities globally. So let me then go very briefly over the world of averages and the world of heterogeneity, and then finish with the so-called elephant chart, which sort of shows the developments in global inequality in the last period, last 30 years approximately. The world of averages is the world where we actually don't look at distribution within countries, we just look at mean country incomes. And I illustrated here with something that I already mentioned, essentially, is that how this world of averages has been driving global inequality. Here on a graph, you look at relative incomes of China, Indonesia, and India in comparison to the UK, or in the case of Indonesia with respect to the Netherlands, over the last 2 centuries. And of course, what you see is that these countries in Asia have really sort of been impoverished during the period of colonization. So you actually see a dramatic decline of their relative income, because the relative incomes are shown on the vertical axis in percent of the colonial powers' relative income. And then you see that actually there is an upswing after the 1970s, where actually these countries are becoming richer. So then let me go into the changes which have happened over the last 30 years. First of all, we have a change which you can call the emergence of the global middle class. Now, that middle class, we have to use that term a little bit carefully, because it is the middle class from the global perspective, simply because these are people who are in the middle of the global income distribution. But compared to the Western perspective, these are people and their incomes that are relatively low. If you compare, however, the distribution in 1988 and the distribution in 2011, what you notice is that there is this middle of the distribution, which is now much thicker than it was in 1988. You notice the red line, which shows global distribution in 2011, being significantly more above, or thicker, more important than the blue line around the middle of the income distribution. So this is this emerging global middle class, even if the name global is, as I say, somewhat a misnomer, because it includes people from all kind of levels, from $3 or $4 per day, which is relatively low, to people who have about 16 or up to even $20 per day, which is better, but still, again, by Western standards, would be relatively low income. And that was, of course, led to having global income distribution now in 2013, that we have the sort of most recent data, 2013/14, where we have global poverty according to the World Bank poverty line, which is about 10% of the global population. So these are the people that you can see on the horizontal axis with incomes below $600 per day. So essentially, it is income which is below $2 per day. So this is this global poverty of 10% of people. Then we have the median income, which is, as you can see here, at $2,600 per annum. And that is significantly below the mean income, which is at about $6,000 annually. Now, the median income of the rich countries, and that's the abbreviation, stands for Western Europe, North America, and Oceania, is at the 95th percentile of the global income distribution. Now, this is important to highlight and to make very clear, is that essentially when we talk about income distribution in rich countries, whether it be US or Denmark or Germany or Japan, we are really talking about the distributions which take place within the top 20% of the world distribution. So all these changes and fights about income and the gains of the rich on the account of the poor really happen at what is globally, from the global perspective, what is really the top quintile or the top 20% of the population. So in other words, rich countries do not have too many people who are below the 80th percentile of the global income distribution. You will see that you will find some of them, but they are relatively few. So then, how did global income distribution change between 1988 and 2011 or 2008 in this particular graph? It has changed in a way that is in some sense intuitive, and that what this graph shows you on the horizontal axis, you have people lined up by their percentile in the global income distribution, from the people on the left who are the poorest, you know, the bottom 5%, to the people on the right who are the richest, and it's really this famous top 1%. Now, what you notice on the vertical axis, and what is shown on the vertical axis, is the real income increase in percentage, cumulative percentages over these 20 years. And what the graph shows very clearly is that the cumulative rise of income has been the strongest around the middle of the income distribution, where we indeed find the bulk of the population from Asian countries. Not only China, because of course we focus on China since China had such a dramatic development, but there are other countries. There is India, there is Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam. They all had significant expansion of their own middle of the income distribution or higher parts of the distribution, but from the global perspectives, they are not very rich. I mean, people who are not at the very top of the income distribution. But then the second point, which is, this is like our first point that you can call, quote unquote, China's middle class that had a very good period during the globalization. Then the second point are people who are richer than the so-called China's middle class, but they didn't have a very good period during these 20 or 25 years. And you can call them US lower middle class. They still remain richer than people in China, but they really had very little growth. And indeed, this observation is something that has, of course, led some people in the US to actually blame that China and to blame the rules of globalization to have been too favorable to China and to have essentially taken jobs from the United States and sort of transplanted them and sent them over to Asia and to China in particular. And then the third point, which is important in this graph, is the point of the global top 1%, where you actually notice very large gains in relative percentage terms, but even much more so when we translate these gains in absolute terms. So these are the people who actually had, during the period of the high globalization before the economic crisis, an extremely good time, and they have actually gained a lot. So this is the picture of the world as of, like, the snapshot as of the global financial crisis. And if I were to summarize, I would say that the globalization, technological change, and policy decisions during these 20 plus years have been really very good for the middle classes in Asia and for the global top 1%, call it the plutocrats, but it was not a good period for the middle classes in the rich countries. And this would be, I think, my last graph. And if I now were to update, as I recently did, and it's an unpublished paper, that same graph, pushing it to 2013, the situation is a little bit different. Is what you notice when you push the data to 2013 and compare 2013 situation to 2008, is that you still continue having significant gains in the middle. Again, these are the Asian countries that we were talking about, that you still have absence of growth, or very meager, very modest growth for the middle classes in the rich countries, but that you now do not have this really snout of the elephant being so high as it was in the time of high globalization. And why are the top 1% globally not doing so well now after the global financial crisis? The reason is that the global financial crisis led to significant losses in capital incomes for the global top 1%, who are actually generally people from the rich countries in their top income distribution, not only in the top 1%, for example, 11% of the richest Americans belong to the global top 1%, and they didn't have good time, or actually they didn't have prosperous time after the financial crisis. So the financial crisis was a big shock from which they recovered a little bit later, but it still remained a shock compared to the gains that were kept on being realized by the middle classes in Asia. So what used to be the elephant graph is now a little bit different in 2013. And very likely it would remain like this after this crisis, because what we can see now with the corona crisis is that rich countries in the West seem to have been affected more than countries in Asia, on the assumption that India does not get affected as badly as the rich world. And that would actually mean that in the future, we might actually expect a global graph to look more or less like this particular graph, which means really continued gains for Asia and for the middle classes in Asia, and continued stagnation of incomes for the middle classes in the rich countries, and not really a significant recovery for the global top 1%. So let me stop here, because this is the last part, which is kind of speculative. We obviously do not know what will be the effects of the crisis, but we can actually do a little bit by sort of analogy with what happened during the global financial crisis in order to understand what will be the effects of the coronavirus. Thank you very much. And then I hope I would be able to get in touch with you, answer some questions, and discuss these issues much more. Thank you.